Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Got a fascinating topic for us to explore today. Did Christians eat with the dead in the early church? This is going to be a fascinating issue to examine in early church history, and we're going to maybe even see some traces of it that still remain today. And so we're going to dive into this topic known as the refrigerium. We're going to talk all about it. But before we do so, I want to remind you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button if you appreciate historical commentary, analysis, if you like commentary on what's going on in the world today as well, or just topics of a theological nature, hit that subscribe button. So I have a short PowerPoint presentation that I just prepared for y'all. It's not exhaustive by any means, but it's intended to kind of introduce the conversation. Now, I've talked about this before on the channel, and I think that for most of us who are aware of church history, we're aware of a concept where in Christian history, there is an incorporation of pagan elements into Christianity. You in fact, even have this in Judaism in the Old Testament. And we've talked about some of those Old Testament instances that you can find in the Bible, especially with the temple. But we've discussed historically some aspects where Christianity has taken some pagan elements and baptized them, if you will, and made them Christian, incorporated them into Christianity and Christian society, and given a Christian theological interpretation to them. This is a policy that has been officially approved, especially by the Catholic Church, for at least 1,500 years, if not older than that. We can see cases where Augustine of Canterbury is writing to the Pope and asking him, hey, what do we do with all these pagan temples? Do we just demolish them, and rebuild on top of them? What do we do? And they make it clear, look, keep the buildings. You don't have to destroy these pagan temples. Just, strip them of their idols and start saying mass there. So we constantly see this idea of, take whatever you can find in paganism and adapt it to Christianity insofar as possible. And anything that you can't do that with, discard that. But anything you can do that with, preserve it in order to sustain continuity and make it easier for pagans to be incorporated into Christian society. So for better or worse, like it or not, this has just been the policy, and we see this all over Christian society, whether we're talking about the liturgy in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox churches, or we're talking about the construction of buildings, or the even philosophy in Christianity. No matter what we're talking about, this aspect, this element is there. And this is one example, and it might be an example you haven't heard of, but it's called the refrigerium. And so we're going to dive into that today. And so let me share my screen. And I say this tongue in cheek, right? Because we often hear about the Jewish roots of Christianity. Well, I named this one the pagan roots of Christianity, kind of tongue in cheek, right? I mean, because there is an element of truth to this, right? There are, obviously, Christianity is not just simply a pagan religion, briefly modified and adapted. No, that's not at all what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that Christianity has, much like Judaism, taken some elements of paganism and incorporated them into these religious communities. And again, we see that in the Old Testament, we see that in part in the New Testament, and we certainly see that in church history. And we're going to explain why. I'm going to go over why this was done. We're going to look at Augustine and Jerome, who are very open about this phenomenon and saying, look, here's why this happened. So I'll explain that here in a little bit. But the pagan roots of Christianity, the refrigerium. Okay, let's talk about the concept of the dead being still considered alive. I mean, obviously, we see this in the question of the intercession of the saints, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about praying to the saints and asking the saints to intercede on our behalf. That's not what we're referring to here. Watch this. This is from Ramsey McCollum. McCollman. And he writes in his work, Christianity and Paganism in the 4th century to 8th century, on page 110, he writes the following. This is McMullen. Evidently, people loyal to these customs took over from the non-Christian thought world the certainty that the deceased continued in some form of life and activity within the tomb. Now notice this concept. You'll see why it's important in a bit. The idea here in paganism was not just that somehow the dead are still alive somewhere else, in heaven or in hell or something. It was also the concept that they were still alive in the tomb, in the grave. There was still some experience that they had in the tomb. This was imported into Christianity in early church history, where Christians adopted this concept that other Christians, deceased and martyrs especially, were not just alive in heaven, but actually alive in the grave, experiencing things in the grave. It says, of sanctified martyrs, this is seen to be true in accounts of the early medieval West noted above, but there are various express statements of the same view descriptive of the humble dead as well. The bishops at Elvira, you may have heard of the Synod of Elvira before, in the early 4th century, for instance, advised the faithful not to light candles at tombs, lest they disturb those sleeping beneath. So they believed that if you light the candles near the tombs of the deceased, that will disturb the deceased. Why? Because the deceased are still experiencing life somehow in that tomb. So what you do here on earth, near that tomb or to them in the tomb, will still impact them in the afterlife. The Synod of Elvira, Canon 34, says, candles shall not be burned in a cemetery during the day, for the spirits of the saints are not to be disturbed. So if you have this candle near their tomb, that would disturb them. Those who do not observe this are excluded from the communion of the church. They're excommunicated. So you can see that concept in that canon. Now, as to the refrigerium, it means refreshment. You can probably see that in the word refrigerator, right? It has the refreshments inside. Refrigerium is the Latin equivalent of a Greek term meaning refreshment, used among pagans and early Christians to signify both spiritual solace and the banquet celebrated for the memory of well-being of a deceased person near his tomb. So what the pagans did was, and this was several centuries before Jesus and before Christianity, Greek and Roman pagans would go to the tombs of their deceased loved ones, and they would share a meal with the dead. They would put food and drink in the decomposing body or the skeleton and eat with them. And they would even set up tables and set up chairs where they would imagine that, they're sitting down. The dead is sitting there participating in the meal with the living. Now, this practice was adapted and adopted by the early Christian community and also some Jewish people. But early Christians took this concept from paganism of eating meals with the dead, and they began to do it themselves. Now, the word refrigerium, just meaning refreshment, is used in the Old Testament and the New Testament story of the rich man requesting of Lazarus that he freshen his tongue in Luke 16:24, as well as by St. Paul, who says that Onesiphorus frequently gave him refreshment in 2 Timothy. Likely not a reference to what the pagans were doing here. This is just more in general refreshment. Likely not this elaborate meal. Be that as it may, it is a term that comes up there in the Old and New Testament. Now, archaeologically, we know some things about these refrigerium feasts and celebrations. Early testimonies to the practice are archaeological. We find stone chairs for the deceased in the Roman catacombs. I've personally been to these Roman catacombs, and I've actually seen this concept. This is where I first became aware of the concept of a refrigerium. We went to one of the catacombs, and they started talking about how there were these meals that were taking place here, that Christians were doing, eating meals with the dead. And I'm thinking, well, that's a little different. I knew of masses with the dead, beneath, right above their tomb or something, but I didn't know of like full blown meals. Although that's interesting because the Eucharist was originally celebrated in a full blown meal, an agape feast. Table that for now, though. But I heard of this concept and I thought, this is interesting. And they were talking about how that came from the Greeks and Romans, and this was a practice that the pagans did. So, elsewhere in the West, we see this of the 3rd century and later, or sometimes an inscription on a nearby wall making the invitation to the dead explicit. Join in the refreshment, the refrigerium. This is an ancient Roman custom later adopted by some early Christians of holding a commemorative meal for the dead, often near their tombs. And such arrangements may be seen in the 3rd century Spanish, German, Italian, and North African Christian cemeteries. So it's very widespread. And in Eastern church directives, they receive not condemnation, but a reminder that priests, Christian priests, should feel free to join in such cheerful banquets. So there was some hesitation among some of the bishops and some of the Christians, even in the East. And they're like, wait, I don't know about this. And so there's directives saying, hey, it's okay. Even the priests can participate in this thing. Here's a picture of it. You can see here this figure joined by these other people around the table eating with them. This one I call Happy Hour for the Dead, tongue-in-cheek. At a second inland city, Timgad in Numidia, excavation presents us with a 5th century martyr's burial, half sunk at mid-nave of its chapel. So this is inside a Christian chapel, 5th century. The raised part of the tomb being equipped with a hollowed out cup, a strainer, and a funnel leading down into the tomb to the mouth of the skull beneath. So we can find this archaeologically. 5th century churches in a chapel, you got an actual tube going into the mouth of the skull beneath. Why? What was this for? So whenever they were celebrating these meals with the dead, they could pour wine into the mouth of the deceased. Because again, they believed that deceased person was experiencing life even in the tomb, and was experiencing this refreshment, food and drink. The dead were experiencing this. And again, this came from this pagan concept where they did the same, but it found its way into Christianity. We'll find out why here in a moment. Now, in Rome, this practice was incredibly popular and widespread. In Rome, the focus of cult was naturally on Peter and Paul, because tradition says Peter and Paul were martyred there. At various times and points in and about the city, the apostles were the object of pilgrimage recorded in hundreds of graffiti. The largest number under the present day San Sebastiano, which I got to go to that particular catacomb in Rome before. Here, as elsewhere, the faithful acquitted themselves of vows to provide the martyrs with the refreshment of a banquet in return for their favor. So here's what was going on. These Christians believe, okay, Peter and Paul are martyred either here or nearby. So I'm going to go over to Rome and I'm going to feed and feast with the remains of Peter and Paul in exchange for their favor, in exchange for their prayers. You know, if I want Peter and Paul to pray for me and you know, do something for me, maybe if I have this great need, I ask Peter and Paul, hey, help me get this need. But the way to do that is make a vow. I'm going to go to Rome and I'm going to give the remains of Peter and Paul food and drink. And I'm going to refresh them because they're in need of this food and drink in the tomb. So I'm going to provide that need to them, hoping that they provide my needs to me. And here in these catacombs, it lets them know, hey, now that you've come here and you've done this, you've fulfilled your vow. You've done your part. If you've come here, you came to this catacomb, you feasted with the dead, you did your part. So continuing this, here as elsewhere, the faithful acquitted themselves of vows to provide the martyrs with the refreshment of a banquet in return for their favor. One memorial was pierced to receive the pouring in of wine, while the pair together under San Sebastiano were equipped with a handy dining area and benches. So they had dining areas, benches, places where you can pour in wine and feast with the dead and provide the dead with nourishment and refreshment. In the catacombs of St. Sebastian, the custom of holding a banquet after the burial of a relative or a friend, as well as the celebration of the anniversary of death near the tomb or mausoleum with a commemorative meal, was common among the Greeks and Romans. And this is something described by Tertullian. He mentions how this was a pagan custom well before Christianity. It was observed also among the Jews. So some Jews adopted this custom. These are likely Hellenized Jews, right? The same custom was followed by the early Christians, as is attested by the discovery in the catacombs of St. Sebastian of a banquet room, on the walls of which were graffiti or inscriptions, signifying that pilgrims had satisfied a vow by celebrating a refrigerium in their honor, in the honor of Saints Peter and Paul, or near Peter and Paul. So in the case of Peter and Paul, you came to Rome, you fulfilled this vow. You didn't actually have to go and pour in wine into the mouth of the skull of Peter and Paul, but you could do it nearby, and that satisfied the vow. There are also pictorial representations of a refrigerium in several tombs. Commodianus advises, if you wish to refresh your soul, go to the martyrs. So if you wish to refresh your soul, refresh the martyrs by giving them food and drink. Now, there's this concept known as the psychosabaton that you can see today in Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic liturgies. It refers to the practice of commemorating the dead on the Saturday of Souls, again, either in Eastern Orthodoxy or Eastern Catholicism. And it's not just, exclusive to the Byzantine tradition, but I am highlighting Eastern Orthodoxy and Eastern Catholicism. Now, this includes what's called a Panikhida. You've probably seen this many times if you've been to Eastern Orthodox Church or Eastern Catholic Church. This is a memorial service where they have the koliva, which is a dish made of boiled wheat berries or rice and honey. It's blessed by the priest, usually right after the Divine Liturgy. And then it's eaten by the community. If you go to the local Greek Orthodox Church, they do it once a month, right after the Divine Liturgy of Chrysostom, or maybe Basil, depending on what Sunday it is. Right after that, they'll do this extra little liturgy where they take this dish, the priest blesses it, memorializes the dead, calls for the refreshment of the souls of the dead. Sometimes it's the dead who previously went to the parish. And then it's eaten by the community. I want to point this out. A service celebrated on behalf of an individual on these days will usually take place at the grave site historically. So these services that we're referring to here in Eastern Orthodoxy, Eastern Catholicism, usually took place at the actual grave. Nowadays, that's not necessarily the case. It might just take place in the church. But kind of historically, it was at the grave site. Memorial services for all the faithful who have departed. Sometimes they occur in the church or at the gravesite, as do services for those whose graves may be located at a far distance. But notice what this is talking about. It's talking about this service where you're blessing food in the context of refreshment for the dead, and then everyone eats the food. What does that sound like to you? That sounds very much like the concept of the refrigerium, right? But maybe just a slightly modified version of it. Is this perhaps a remnant of an earlier practice of the refrigerium? I certainly think so. Most unquestionably, I think this is clearly still the liturgical traces of this earlier practice that originated not actually in Christianity, but in paganism itself. And you can see that now still in the Byzantine liturgy, whether we're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy or Eastern Catholicism. Hardly controversial, given that numerous elements of the liturgy, whether we're talking about Latin Rite, traditional Latin Mass, Novus Ordo, whether we're talking about Catholics, Orthodox, whatever we're talking about, numerous liturgical elements originated in paganism. Hardly controversial, given numerous elements of the temple and its sacrifices and worship in the Old Testament originated in paganism. So now, in the canon of the Mass, you have something curious. The Roman canon of the Mass, obviously originating in Rome. Maybe it's referring to this concept. It speaks to them, O Lord, and to all resting in Christ, we beg you to grant a place of refreshment, life, and peace. Now, that's kind of general. That's kind of generic. That's not necessarily speaking of this more elaborate form of celebrating the meal with the dead, but it is interesting that it's taking place in the context of the Eucharist, which the New Testament sees as both a sacrifice and as a meal. It's called the Lord's table in some cases in the New Testament. And it was celebrated in the context of a greater meal, the agape feast. Might this be a trace of that, a hint of that older practice? I don't know, maybe, but I did find it curious. Now, Augustine talks about this, and he's not happy with it. He does not like this. But he explains why this happens. Why is it that these pagans are coming into the church, bringing with them all sorts of pagan elements and Christianizing them? Augustine doesn't like it. Some of the bishops in his area, they didn't like it. They see these men and women dancing at these feasts, and they're like, I don't know about this dancing stuff. It's kind of weird. Or women not wearing a veil, showing their hair, maybe even showing their ankles. They're like, what is going on? Their concept of modesty was obviously very different than many in the United States today. But the point was, there's all this dancing going on at these feasts, and some of the women are showing their hair and even their ankles, and what in the world is going on? This is just completely inappropriate. Why is this happening? They're horrified by some of this stuff. Well, Augustine gives us a curious answer. He says, for when peace came after so many and such violent persecutions, crowds of pagans wishing to become Christians were prevented from doing this because of their habit of celebrating the feast days of their idols with banquets and carousing. So he's saying, a lot of these pagans, they found it hard to become a Christian. Why? Well, they'd have to give up these feast days to their idols, and they really love their feast days, and they love the carousing. So they found it really difficult to give that up. And since it was not easy for them to abstain from these dangerous but ancient pleasures, our ancestors, he's talking about the bishops before him in Hippo and others in North Africa, as well as really just all over, right? Our ancestors thought it would be good to make a concession for the time being to their weaknesses. Because these pagans are weak, because they're so attached to their feasts and carousing, our ancestors said, let's make a concession here. Let's make this work. And permit them, instead of the feast they had renounced, to celebrate other feasts in honor of the holy martyrs. Not with the same sacrilege, but with the same elaborateness and luxury. So he's saying, look, okay, they can't celebrate their feast to the idols. We can't allow that in Christianity for obvious reasons, but we can allow them to do the same stuff, the same feasts, the same things they love to do with the feast for the idols, but just do it to the martyrs instead of the idols. That was the idea. And Augustine's very open about this. He doesn't like it in some cases, but he's being very candid in explaining why this is happening and why it's going on. It was out of concession. You can't expect too much from the pagans, so allow them to continue their pagan practices, but just change the name of this god to the name of a saint. This is St. Augustine. And it's not just him, and it's not just limited to the ones I'm going to show you, but Augustine's a huge one. But also Jerome, St. Jerome, gave us the Latin Vulgate, incredibly important church father, much like St. Augustine, very important. I'd argue in some cases, Augustine might be even more important. But in other areas, Jerome might even be more important in some cases, right? Especially with the Vulgate. Both of these heavy hitters, and they knew each other. And by the way, they squared off with each other. So they fought with each other back and forth. They didn't agree theologically on some points. But anyways, Jerome is confronted with the reality of this. And he's talking to somebody who says, look, what in the world are you doing? Jerome, you got all these pagan practices going on right in front of you, and you're allowing this. You're allowing the Christians to engage in these pagan practices. Why would you allow that? That's wrong. Watch how Jerome explains it and defends it. As to the question of tapers, however, we do not, as you in vain misrepresent us, light them in the daytime. He's saying we don't light the candles in the daytime. Remember that canon against doing that? But by their solace we would cheer the darkness of the night and watch the dawn, lest we should be blind like you and sleep in darkness. And if some persons, being ignorant and simple-minded laymen, or at all events religious women, he seems to have thought very poorly here of religious women, right? I mean, if there's some really ignorant people out there like religious women, he would have been canceled today, right? Simple-minded laymen, or at all events religious women, of whom we can truly say, then referring to Romans, I allow that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. In other words, they're passionate about the faith, but they don't know what they're talking about. If those people adopt the practice in honor of the martyrs, what harm is done thereby to you? So that thing that Augustine was talking about, them taking these pagan practices, taking it from paganism, and instead of doing it to an idol, just do it to a martyr. Jerome's like, look, if they do this in ignorance because they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they're talking about, what's the problem? Once upon a time, even the apostles pleaded that the ointment was wasted, but they were rebuked by the voice of the Lord. Christ did not need the ointment, nor do martyrs need the light of tapers, and yet that woman poured out the ointment in honor of Christ. And her heart's devotion was accepted. So in other words, the martyrs don't need you lighting candles near their tomb. But you know what? God might still honor the intentions of their heart, even if they don't know what they're doing, even if they don't realize they're wrong for this. All those who light these tapers have their reward according to their faith, as the apostle says. Let everyone abound in his own meaning. Do you call men of this sort idolaters? I do not deny that all of us who believe in Christ have passed from the era of idolatry. For we are not born Christians, but we become Christians by being born again. And because we formerly worshipped idols, does it follow that we ought not now to worship God, lest we seem to pay like honor to him and idols? In the one case, respect was paid to the idols, and therefore the ceremony was to be abhorred, to be rejected. But in the other, the martyrs are venerated, and the same ceremony is therefore to be allowed. So he's outright saying, look, this practice was wrong because it was done to idols. But you know what? As long as it's done to the martyrs, it's okay. So again, it's the concept of taking elements of paganism, even liturgical elements of paganism, and instead of doing it to an idol, doing it to a martyr. Now, let me blow your mind here without getting in too far off track. Is that exactly what the Vatican was attempting to do with the quote-unquote Pachamama controversy? and other elements that you see with John Paul II, kind of taking some of these elements and bringing them into the liturgy, or the Mayan liturgy, or X, Y, and Z, all this stuff that you hear about. Is that what's kind of going on? Well, I find it curious that a lot of people will criticize those things today, especially traditional Catholics criticize those things. But ironically, those things are present in the very liturgies in which they venerate and love. They just don't realize it. And it's right there in church history as a practice. They just don't realize it anymore because they're no longer in that context. Be that as it may, I want to share my screen again. An unrelated yet related point. Talking about these pagan practices and how doing something to the body of the deceased still impacts the deceased, but a little unrelated to the refrigerium. I came across something fascinating, because this involves Pope Pius IX, who died in 1878. At his burial funeral, at his burial rites, at his funeral, they placed the coin of Charon on his mouth. Do you know what this is? This is fascinating. They say even the coin for Charon sometimes turned up in Christian burials of the West and East alike, bringing the custom up to the last rites of Pius IX in 1878. What is this? You've probably seen this in the movies. You know how in pagan concepts, you would have, whenever you die, you got to cross this river, and there's this ferryman, a guy who has a boat, who comes up to the shore, and he's going to take you to the other side. He takes you from the land of the living to the land of the dead. You've seen this in numerous movies, right? This is a pagan concept that came from the Greeks and Romans. And so what the pagans would do is, well, that ferryman, he's not going to take you to the other side for free. You got to pay him, right? So what they would do is they would place some coins and money on your mouth when you died, so that you can bribe the guy. It's a coin for Charon. The Charon is like the guy who takes you over. I guess that's how you pronounce him, but Charon. They place it on your mouth, and then you take that coin when you're dead, and you give it to the ferryman, and he takes you from the land of living to the land of the dead. All right, now obviously this is not only a pagan concept, but this is in many ways incompatible with Christianity theologically, right? But you could still see a trace of that as recent as Pope Pius IX's burial in 1878. Why? Because again, Christians, when the empire went from paganism to Christianity, a ton of pagans came into Christianity, as Augustine is saying. And with that, they brought a lot of pagan practices, as Augustine was saying and complaining about, but attempting to explain. And this is one of those cases lasting up to 878. Now, some of those practices still last today in the Catholic liturgy, in the Orthodox liturgies, and even non-Catholic and non-Eastern Orthodox liturgies, and also in elsewhere in Christian society. But this one was fascinating because I wasn't even aware of it. But they placed the coin on the Pope's mouth, so that when he gets to the afterlife, he can bribe the ferryman to take him to the other side. Now, this is obviously completely incompatible with Catholic eschatology and Catholic afterlife, right? It's just not at all Catholic concept, and is contrary to Catholic tradition and Catholic theology. And yet it's still being practiced. It seems safe to surmise that the people in charge of the Pope's burial were Christians, according to anyone's definition. Well, yeah, I mean, these were bishops and cardinals and so on. In charge of the Pope's burial were Christians, according to anyone's definition. Yet in some corner of their picture of the afterlife could be found beliefs at odds with the picture that would be agreed to by the bishops assembled. In other words, you know, if you really pushed them, they would have to say, yeah, look, this tradition is at odds with Christian theology, but we're still keeping this practice. it's yet another example of how some of those things that were incorporated into Christianity, they did originate in paganism. Now, how much of them can be legitimately assimilated into Catholic theology or, broadly speaking, Christian theology versus are some of those incompatible? That's going to vary on who you talk to. You talk to a Protestant, they're going to say a ton of stuff in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy is pagan and incompatible with Christianity. However, in Catholicism, the response is going to be, actually, no, a lot of these things, yeah, sure, they originated paganism, but, they're compatible and you can assimilate, and there's some good found in paganism, and they can be baptized. And, so it just kind of depends on who you're talking to as far as what can be assimilated, what can't, how you view it. In this particular case, I think everybody can agree this is just completely incompatible with the Christian paradigm of the afterlife. Okay. I do want to offer something for further exploration. Maybe some of y'all can look into. Maybe I'll look into it at some point, but it jumped out at me, and I kind of hinted at this before. There are clearly some connections with the concept of the refrigerium in the Agape Feast, which is the earliest setting of the Mass, the Eucharist, the celebration of the Eucharist. Additional work should be done in demonstrating points of both continuity and discontinuity between them. I think you'll find both. I think you'll find some elements that are in continuity and some that aren't. Again, remember, biblically, the Mass, the Eucharist, was originally celebrated in the context of a meal. That doesn't mean it wasn't seen as a sacrifice, but it was still celebrated in the context of a meal. This is indisputable. It's very clearly in the Bible. That's why the Protestants tend to highlight and focus on the Eucharist as a meal as opposed to a sacrifice. Of course, from the Catholic perspective, it's a both and. From Eastern Orthodox perspective, both and. From the biblical perspective, I think you can argue it's a both and. You have elements of both. Now, you might have an emphasis on one as opposed to the other, but I think they're both present. Be that as it may, it takes place in the context of this meal where they're actually eating a ton of food, bread, wine, and stuff, and then participating in the Eucharist at some point. Paul speaks about this in 1 Corinthians. Obviously, there's some application here with the refrigerium because this is a meal being celebrated not only in community, but also in fellowship with the saints. Because the Mass is not only something that takes place on earth, it's in fellowship with all of those in heaven as well. Clearly, there is some connection between that and the refrigerium. That doesn't mean that the Mass came from the refrigerium. That's not what I'm saying. I think that there's certainly some overlap. There's certainly some continuity, but I think also arguably some discontinuity. And my recommendation would be for some people to maybe look further into this and do some deeper research and show what exactly is the relationship. If one didn't depend on the other, originate in the other, maybe at least show what are some points of continuity, discontinuity. Did one inform the other? Did one impact the other? I think that would be a fun thesis to explore. So anybody out there wanting to write a thesis or something, there you go. I just gave you an awesome topic. So, all right. Anyways, like I said, it was a short presentation, not exhaustive, but I wanted to bring it to your attention because I did think it was fascinating, and I'm probably going to do it this as one of other in a series of other videos on the pagan roots of Christianity. Again, tongue in cheek, I have to say that, right? But like we have the Jewish roots of Christianity. I think I might do a series called the Pagan Roots of Christianity because I think people often don't realize how much of some elements in the liturgy and in just Christian life are informed by pagan society. I don't think they realize that. So maybe us going over this would be helpful, and so I might do that as part of a series. We'll see if there's enough interest, if people actually find this interesting. If not, then there's numerous other things that we can talk about and explore. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let me know in the comment section if you want to see more to a series like this, or if this is just a one-off video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And that's going to do it. By the way, check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support the channel. Or I would highly encourage you to go to rtcourses.com, R as in reason, T as in theology, courses.com, to check out any of my courses on the magisterium or the ecumenical councils. Go and check that out and consider exploring some of those courses, as well as some of the free resources that I have available here. I think that you'll find them very, very interesting. Okay, that's going to do it for today. See you later.